times you have felt foolish. Now, there are those times when we feel foolish because we have not attended to something we should have. We've forgotten something. Often we've overlooked something. Why, I can remember many times using a tool the wrong way or spending hours laboring over something only for someone to say, here's the button you push. But not that kind of foolish. Have you ever felt foolish for something that you believed? Part of your faith. Sometimes we believe something for a long time, maybe many years, and then suddenly we question it and we say, does this really? The way it should, is this really the way that it is? Paul comes to a place of realizing that those he loves in the Corinthian church are under such attack. It's not so much that they are questioning Paul's message, but he knows that they are encountering others who not only question, but consider the message of Jesus Christ, of the cross, of him being raised from the dead as mere foolishness. And so Paul begins to talk to this troubled church by reorienting them to the cross. He talks about the foolishness of the world, the wisdom of God, the power and wisdom of God, to be more exacting. He talks about the Greeks who have lifted up wisdom and the Jews who have lifted up their faithful obedience to the law. He talks about how God has displaced them. It has come in the most unexpected way, a way that looks foolish and weak. And in fact, he says, God has specifically chosen to come in this foolish and weak way. And he says he's done that so that our faith might rest in God's power and in God's wisdom and not our own, so that no one may boast in themselves, but only in the Lord. Now, Paul is speaking about the cross, to be sure, but really the cross stands for the entirety of God's revelation. All that God has done, and certainly at the apex of that is the sacrifice of God in Jesus Christ for you and I. And he speaks about our receiving God's righteousness, our receiving redemption, our receiving sanctification, that is a setting apart and a cleansing from God. And we find that in the cross of Jesus. It's as if he's telling the church, don't buy in to what all of the world says to you about your faith. They believe that they are right, but they are in fact wrong. Listen to the message of God. The Greeks had elevated wisdom and the ability to make a very precise argument, an insightful argument. The Jews had elevated their own ability to follow the law in every minutia conceivable. But both, Paul says, elevated their self-righteousness. For you see, then they could boast. The Greeks in a novel and new philosophy, a new way of looking at things. And through this, they believed that they might reach for God and find God in their wisdom. If it could only be a little more insightful and presented a little more forcefully, why then they would be lifted up, and here would be a way that made sense of understanding God and reaching forth for God. And the Jews, Paul says, even though they were chosen, were focused on their own abilities to fulfill the law. And Paul says in the cross, God has come and has told all of the world the things that you are concerned with, I'm not. What an amazing place that is to realize that we might have reached a place in which the things that concern us, or the things that concern a group around us, the things that are concerns of society, are not necessarily the things that most concern God. And Paul says the things that the world lifts up as wisdom, as strength, as a way to reach for God, God has set aside and said, over here is the chosen path. I heard a story this week about a woman who was going through some of her mother's things. And she found a box of old photographs. Well, naturally, as you might imagine, her curiosity was piqued, and she began right there in that storage room to look through some of those old photographs. Some she recognized, some she didn't. And she came across one that was framed. And in it was her mother with a man she didn't recognize. And so she thought to herself all of those questions that would be the first sort of questions you and I would ask. Who is this gentleman? When was this picture taken? I wonder what year this is from. Where is this? What was the occasion? They're all dressed up. Thinking that some of that pertinent information to her might be on the back of the picture, she took it out of the frame and she turned it over, and there on the back, clearly in her mother's handwriting, was the only thing that was really important to her mother. 128 pounds. You know, in this room alone, the things that might be important to one of us might not be important to another. And certainly, when it comes to our faith, we know that the things that are important to us may not be important to the entirety of the world. But Paul is making a very specific argument about the cross that applies to us all. And it has to do with our own abilities, our own efforts, our own self-righteousness. And what he's telling us is the things that seem important to us even when it comes to our faith. The things we borrow from the world and transplant into the world of our faith are not important to God. And he says it's a sobering reality to realize, in light of the cross, that God has snuffed out all of our human attempts at self-righteousness, at reaching out for him in all of our ways that we might subtly lift ourselves up, boast in ourselves. And he says because of this, the cross is a scandal. That's the word he uses. The cross is a scandal. You see, it's easy to look back on Paul's time and think we're exempt from Greeks who love philosophy, or Jews who love obedience to the law. But what he's really saying is, be careful that you have not taken the things that are unimportant to God, but are lifted up in the world, like status, like your own abilities, like what you have done and earned, your rights, your privileges, and take them over into your faith and give them a baptism of sorts and think that this is the way to God. He says, no, God has made a way through the cross of Jesus Christ, which seems foolishness to us, but his point is that we come to the cross with absolutely nothing to bring. We can't bring any elevated arguments. We can't bring our own wisdom. We cannot bring our own obedience, our own righteousness. We do not come with anything in hand to the cross. We come only with our sins and our failures and our shortcomings, and we find only God's mercy and grace completely undeserved. in a subtle way, what he's really saying is it's not what we possess when we come to the cross. It's not, do I possess wisdom? Do I possess right standing with God? Do I have faith as some great commodity that I can offer so that I might boast in my faith? He says, no, it's not about if you possess wisdom as a means to God, but it's, does God possess you? It's not about the righteousness that you bring, it's about the righteousness that God gives. Really what he's saying is that you cannot claim God, reinterpret him, and go about your way boasting. God claims you. He brings you naked to the cross, and he gives you his undeserved mercy and grace, and that is what the cross of Jesus Christ is about. So he says, I didn't come to you with flowery speech, with fabulous, insightful, and incisive arguments of great wisdom. I came to you in fear and trembling. I came to you in concern. But what I shared with you was the power and wisdom of God. Don't overlook it. God has claimed us in Jesus Christ. In the cross, God has given us grace and mercy. And the cross, in some way, represents for us a sense of death.